In the jagged, frozen forests of Karelia, during a winter so brutal it seemed the very air might shatter, a single man redefined the limits of human endurance and the psychological toll of warfare. He was a shadow against the frost, a whisper in a landscape of screaming artillery. He was a man who, by all rights of modern military logic, shouldn't have existed. He was not a product of a prestigious military academy. He carried no grand theories of ballistics or statecraft. He was a diminutive figure, standing barely 5 feet tall, yet he cast a shadow across the Soviet Union that reached the highest halls of the Kremlin. While other legends of the Second World War sought the limelight, becoming symbols of propaganda and icons for the evening news, this man chose a different path. He didn't give interviews. He didn't keep a meticulous diary of his kills. He didn't speak about the war to the neighbors who saw him every day in the decades that followed. For nearly half a century, much of the world didn't even know his name. They only knew the legend of the White Death. They knew the staggering, impossible number, over 500 confirmed kills in less than 100 days. But behind that number was a man of total, impenetrable secrecy. A man who believed that his duty was something to be performed, not performed for an audience. The year was 1939. The world was beginning to hold its breath as the gears of global conflict began to turn. But in the north, the storm had already arrived. In late November, the Soviet Union, a superpower of nearly 170 million people, launched a massive invasion of Finland, a nation of just 3.7 million. The Soviet generals expected a walkover. They predicted that the capital, Helsinki, would fall in a matter of weeks. They brought brass bands to play at the victory parades, and soldiers who were dressed in summer-weight uniforms, convinced they would be home before the true bite of winter began. What they met instead was the winter of the century. The temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees, cold enough to freeze the grease in a tank's gears and turn a man's breath into ice crystals before it even left his lips. The Soviet soldiers, many of them from the warm plains of the south, found themselves trapped in a nightmare, endless white forests, where every tree looked like a sentinel and every snowdrift could hide a mine. The invisible enemy. The Finns didn't fight in traditional formations. They moved on skis, ghosts in white camouflage, who struck from the flanks and vanished before the Soviets could even train their artillery. The silence. In the deep woods, the silence was more terrifying than the noise of battle. It was a silence that meant you were being watched. The Red Army had the numbers. They had thousands of tanks, waves of aircraft, and an inexhaustible supply of men. But Finland had something else. They had the forest. They had the skis. They had an iron-willed concept called sisu, and they had a farmer from the village of Rautjärvi. He was a farmer, accustomed to the grueling sun-up to sundown labor of the rural north. He understood that survival was a matter of routine and quiet discipline. A hunter, he possessed a preternatural understanding of animal behavior, and by extension, human behavior. He knew how to read the wind, how to judge the weight of the snow, and how to stay perfectly still for hours without succumbing to the cold. A man of silence. In his village, talk was cheap, action was everything. When the call to arms came, Simo didn't change his personality to fit the war. Instead, the war adapted to him. He didn't view the invading Soviet divisions as an abstract political force. He viewed them as an invasive species on his land. He approached the task of defending Finland with the same methodical, patient intensity he used when tracking a fox. He packed his gear. He put on his white winter suit. He took his bolt-action M28-30 rifle, an aging weapon with no telescopic sight, and he stepped into the trees. He didn't know he was about to become the most lethal sniper in human history. He just knew that there were men in his woods that didn't belong there, and he was going to make sure they never left. What made Simo Häyhä truly terrifying to the Soviet invaders was his refusal to use modern technology. Most snipers of the era prized their telescopic sights, believing the magnification gave them an edge. Simo threw his away.
Reliability. In -40-degree weather, glass fogged and became brittle. Iron never failed. Simo's preparation was a ritual of survival. He would go to his nest in the pre-dawn darkness, often crawling through the snow to avoid leaving tracks. He would pour water onto the snow in front of his barrel so that the muzzle blast wouldn't kick up a cloud of powder and reveal his position. He would even keep snow in his mouth, a chilling technique designed to cool his breath so that no steam would escape his lips to the freezing air. He would sit motionless for 12 hours at a time. He wasn't just waiting for a target, he was becoming part of the landscape. To the Soviet conscripts, he wasn't a man, he was the wind, he was the frost, he was a ghost that could strike from 400 yards away and leave no trace but a body in the snow. The typical image of a legendary sniper involves a high-powered telescope, a piece of precision glass that brings the enemy's eyes into sharp focus from a mile away. But Simo looked at the telescopic sights of the 1930s and saw only a liability. He refused to use one. To him, the glass was a death sentence. In the sub-zero temperatures of the Finnish winter, a scope was a beacon. The winter sun, even when it was low on the horizon, could catch the lens and create a momentary glint, a flash of light that would act as a flare for any Soviet counter-sniper watching the tree line. Furthermore, a scope forced a marksman to raise his head several inches higher to align his eye with the optics. In a game where survival was measured in millimeters, those few inches of exposed forehead were the difference between a successful hunt and a bullet to the brain. Heiha used his M28-30 Mosin Nagant and its simple, rugged iron sights. He was a master of the low profile. He would pack the snow in front of his rifle's muzzle to a hard, issy crust so that the percussion of the shot wouldn't kick up a telltale cloud of powder. He would even keep a mouthful of snow at all times, a chilling technique designed to cool his breath so that no steam would escape his lips to the freezing air. He didn't just hide, he integrated. He would lie in a shallow depression for hours, sometimes days, becoming a literal part of the permafrost. His heartbeat would slow, his breathing becoming a rhythmic, shallow ghost of a movement. The Soviet soldiers, marching through the drifts, never heard the crack of the rifle over the moaning wind. They would simply see their comrades slump into the snow, life extinguished by an invisible force that left no sound, no flash, and no trace. As the body count rose into the hundreds, the Soviet command began to realize they weren't facing a squad or a platoon. They were being decimated by a single ghost. Panic began to ripple through the Red Army ranks. Entire units, companies of men who should have been pushing towards Helsinki, were diverted for one purpose: to kill the man they now called Belaya Smert, the White Death. But Heiha was a phantom. His survival was based on a set of self-imposed rules that were as rigid as the ice around him. He never fired from the same position twice. He understood that once a shot was taken, the silence of that location was compromised. He would slip away through the brush, moving with the fluidity of a lynx, leaving no tracks on the frozen crust of the snow. He wore pure white camouflage, laundered until it was indistinguishable from the drifts. He moved only when visibility was at its worst, during heavy snowfall or the dim, gray twilight of the Nordic noon. He knew the terrain of the Kola River better than he knew the palm of his hand. He knew which ridges caught the light and which shadows stayed deep even at midday. The Soviets grew desperate. They sent in their elite counter-snipers, men decorated in Moscow, experts in the art of the long shot. They entered the woods with high-end optics and a mandate to bring back Heiha's dog tags. None of them returned. Then, the Soviets tried area denial. They would direct massive barrages of artillery and carpet bombing toward any patch of woods where a single shot had been heard. They would turn the forest into a landscape of splintered timber and fire. But when the smoke cleared and the Red Army moved forward, the White Death would strike again from a different ridge, 500 yards away, as if he had risen from the ashes. No man, regardless of his skill, can outrun the law of averages forever in a theater of total war. On March 6, 1940, the invincibility of Simo Häyhä was finally shattered. During a frantic, close-quarters engagement in the forests of Kola, the Red Army launched a massive push. The distance between the two forces had closed until the combat was a blur of bayonets and submachine guns. In the chaos, a Soviet soldier spotted a flash of white movement near a fallen birch tree. He didn't wait to aim, he fired a stray, lucky shot toward the shape. The round was an explosive bullet. It didn't pass through cleanly. It struck Häyhä in the lower left jaw, detonating on impact. The force of the explosion shattered his face, tearing away his cheek and crushing his jawbone. He fell into the snow, his blood turning the white powder a deep, steaming crimson. His fellow Finnish soldiers found him as the battle subsided. He was unrecognizable. One soldier later remarked that half his head was missing. He was carried from the battlefield on a makeshift stretcher, barely clinging to a heartbeat. He slipped into a deep, dark coma while surgeons in a field hospital worked by candlelight to stitch together what remained of his face. For a week, he lay in a gray limbo, the legendary White Death finally silenced. Then, on March 13, 1940, Simo Häyhä's eyes flickered open. The first thing he heard was the sound of silence. Not the silence of the woods, but the silence of the guns. He woke up to find his bed surrounded by doctors and officers. They told him the news. That very morning, Finland had signed a peace treaty with the Soviet Union. The war was over. Against all odds, the tiny nation had held its ground, and against even greater odds, its greatest protector had survived to see the peace. The timing felt like something out of a myth, as if the land itself had kept him alive just long enough to see the invasion end. When the guns finally fell silent across the Karelian Isthmus in March of 1940, the Finnish people were looking for a savior. They were looking for a face to put on their defiance, a hero to carry the weight of their collective trauma. They looked to the small, soft-spoken man from Rautjärvi, whose exploits had kept the Red Army at bay for those 100 hellish days. But Simo Häyhä was nowhere to be found. For most men who achieve such staggering world historical feats, the path after the war is one of polished medals, lucrative book deals, and the lecture circuit. They become professional veterans, living within the amber of their own legends. Simo Häyhä took a different path. He chose to disappear. He didn't seek the limelight. He didn't write memoirs filled with the visceral details of the kills he had tallied in the frozen dark. He didn't travel from city to city lecturing young cadets on the ballistics of the Mosin Nagant or the psychology of the long shot. He didn't boast in the village taverns, and he didn't allow the Finnish government to turn his story into a commodity. Instead, as soon as he was physically able to walk and work, he returned to the earth. He returned to his farm. The transition from the world's most lethal sniper to a quiet tiller of the soil was seamless for him, because in his mind, the two roles were never distinct. Both required the same fundamental virtues: patience, a respect for the land, and the discipline to see a difficult task through to its conclusion. When journalists or historians would occasionally track him down in his later years, hoping to catch a glimpse of the White Death, they found only a modest farmer who seemed genuinely puzzled by their interest. When pressed, when asked how a single man could have possibly harvested so many lives in such a short window of time, he wouldn't offer a tactical breakdown or a philosophical treatise on war. He would look them in the eye, his face still bearing the heavy, jagged scars of the explosive bullet that had tried to claim him, and answer with a simplicity that was more chilling than any boast. I did what I was told to do, as well as I could. That was all. To Simo, there was no myth. There was only the duty of the moment. The war was just a season of particularly hard labor, and now that it was over, there was no reason to speak of it. In the decades following World War II, the figure of the war hero became a carefully curated image. From the Soviet Union to the United States, veterans were used as tools of propaganda, their stories smoothed over and sharpened to serve the interests of the state. But Simo Häyhä resisted this gravitational pull with every fiber of his being. He remained a legend without a voice. He never allowed himself to become a political symbol. He gave no speeches at rallies. He participated in no state-sponsored myth-building. He lived in a house he built with his own hands, far from the capital, far from the cameras. He was a man who understood that the true cost of war is paid in silence, and he honored that cost by refusing to turn his service into a performance. The Finnish people respected him for this precisely because it was so quintessentially Finnish. In the culture of the North, there is a deep, abiding respect for the vaikenamine, the practice of silence. They understood that Simo's secrecy wasn't something imposed upon him by a military censor or a protective government. It was chosen. It was an act of profound self-possession. By refusing to speak, he retained ownership of his own life. He refused to let the White Death consume the man named Simo. He understood that once you start telling your story to the world, the story no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the audience, and Simo Häyhä was a man who belonged to no one but himself and the land he defended. This silence created a different kind of aura around him. It made the legend feel more authentic, more grounded in reality. While other snipers' tallies were questioned and their stories scrutinized, the sheer quiet weight of Simo Häyhä's record stood unchallenged. He didn't need to argue for his place in history because he clearly didn't care if he had one. The life of Simo Häyhä proves something fundamentally uncomfortable about the nature of warfare and human lethality. We are conditioned by cinema and fiction to believe that the most dangerous men are the loudest, the proudest, the ones with the most swagger. Simo Häyhä shattered that archetype. He showed the world that the most lethal soldiers are often the ones who want to be remembered the least. They are the ones who view violence not as an expression of ego, but as a technical requirement of survival. Sometimes, the deadliest weapon on a battlefield isn't the most advanced rifle or the largest artillery piece. It is the man who has mastered the art of discipline and silence. It is the man who can sit in the sub-zero dark, pulse steady, breath suppressed, waiting for the one moment where he is needed and then vanishing as if he were never there. Simo Häyhä didn't live in secrecy because he was ashamed or because he was hiding from his past. He lived in secrecy because that was who he was. He was a man of the earth, a man who understood that the most important things in life, the growth of a crop, the track of an animal, the defense of a home, all happen in the quiet. He was a reminder that the world's greatest sniper wasn't a product of a military machine, but a product of a quiet, disciplined life. When he finally passed away at the age of 96, he did so as he had lived. Quietly, without fanfare, in a small town near the border he had once guarded. He left behind a record that will likely never be broken, and a legacy of silence that is even more impressive. He proved once and for all that you don't need to shout to be heard by history. Sometimes, the most powerful message you can leave behind is the one you never bother to speak.